Welcome to Making Peace Visible. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. Our guest today, Tim Phillips, is the director of a unique peace-building organization called Beyond Conflict. Tim is a peace builder who spent decades working on challenging conflicts all over the world, in Central America, Ireland, the Balkans, South Africa, and Israel-Palestine. About 12 years ago, he realized that the field of conflict resolution was missing something crucial: an up-to-date understanding of how the human brain works. Most people in his field were working under the old Enlightenment assumption that human beings are inherently rational beings. But science tells a different story. Since then, Tim and Beyond Conflict have worked with neuroscientists and psychologists to understand how the brain processes emotions like fear and disgust, and apply that knowledge to negotiations and anti-polarization efforts. In this conversation, we focus on their research on dehumanization. If you perceive another person or group as less than human, it's much easier to justify violence against that group or person. But Tim says if we can identify signs of dehumanization early on, we can make changes to decrease the likelihood of violent conflict. Well, Tim, thanks very much for joining us today on Making Peace Visible. You've been working on peace building for a long time. When did you realize that brain science was kind of the missing piece of the puzzle?
Well, thank you, Jamil. Yeah, I've been thinking about this recently. I've been doing this work as an organization, Beyond Conflict. Previously, we had a different name called the Project on Justice in Times of Transition. We changed the name. But we started in 1991 as this organization. And then previously, I started doing work mostly in Central America starting in 1987. But to your question about the brain science, at the core of Beyond Conflict's approach is what we call the power of shared experience. And the best sort of analogy, it's like a big support group on wheels. We would bring in leaders at different levels who sat across profound divides, often in violent conflicts, never imagined they could sit across the table from their enemy, or that real change could happen. And in many places where conflict was deeply rooted over not just decades, in some cases, generations. And as an American, I was often, standing behind setting the table and bringing these people in. And then about 12 years ago, I was teaching a class over at the Fletcher School, Law and Diplomacy, and it was called Conflict Transformation in the 21st Century, the Human Dimension, because I felt, and this is all due respect for my colleagues in the conflict resolution field, I thought a lot of the theory was missing something really important, which is the grounded human experience of conflict. And so one class I had Jerry Adams come in from Northern Ireland. For those who don't know, he was the leader of Sinn Féin. He was on the Senior Army Council of the Irish Republican Army and one of the central figures of the Troubles. And a student raised her hand and said, Mr. Adams, how do you sit across the table from somebody you may have tried to kill, or they may have tried to kill you or somebody close to you? And he thought for a second and said, it's tough to make peace with a humiliated partner. And there was this retired neuroscience scientist sitting in the class. He had been observing the classes. And after this class, he came up to me and he said, there's a lot of brain and behavioral science research behind these themes of humiliation, empathy, and fear. He said, speaking as a scientist, we are not rational beings with emotions. In fact, we're just the opposite. We're emotionally based beings who can only think rationally when we feel that our identities, as we see them, are understood and valued by others.
And it's that last part that is missing in so many conversations about, people making changes in the way they perceive each other.
Yeah.
It's starting from the point of feeling accepted. What's the difference between dehumanization and prejudice?
It's a really key question. I go back to that class at the Fletcher School. I went up to this retired neuroscientist, and he said, listen, we need to focus on how we think, not what we think as humans. Mm-hmm. More than 90% of how we think is below the level of conscious access. And I remember going to MIT, and they said to me, we're minting PhDs in economics and political science here at MIT who are still taught that humans are fundamentally rational beings. When we know here in the cognitive sciences, it's just the opposite. To answer your question simply, prejudice is a precursor under certain conditions to dehumanization.
Mm-hmm.
It's like this connective tissue cognitively that can lead to dehumanization, which can have, in various forms, horrendous outcomes.
But it's not there yet. In other words, it's prejudice it's like on a spectrum of prejudice is one end and dehumanization is
Yeah, when you think of it psychologically,
right.
They're related but different psychological processes. But to discriminate against a group or individuals under the, I could say, right or the worst conditions could lead to acts of dehumanization.
Right. You've been researching dehumanization in 12 countries. And what kind of methods did you use and what kinds of things have you learned from that research?
For about a year or two, we combined researchers with practitioners and other sort of thought leaders in this space.
Mm-hmm.
We did a literature review, and then we brought it all together and say, okay, what do we know about dehumanization, how prejudice and dehumanization exist, and what are the different types of dehumanization? And what we found is the worst is what scientists call animalistic. It's when you describe other humans in terms like they're vermin, they're poison in our bloodstream,
Mm-hmm.
they're rats. It can be mechanistic. Oh, look at those sort of goose-stepping soldiers in North Korea. There's nothing really human about them. They're just sort of very automatic and mechanistic in the way they are. Or it can be what they call objectifying. Misogyny is objectification. It's also related to paternalizing people. But what it all showed was that to dehumanize another doesn't mean you're carrying out an act of violence necessarily. But at a psychological level, you're stripping them of their humanity.
You're diminishing.
You're diminishing them. And
Right.
and what it does, it strips you then of your moral responsibility. And one key takeaway at that initial conference is when a researcher said, dehumanization is literally the way we navigate our social environment. I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, our brain's capacity to fully humanize people is limited to less than 100 people. We're still dealing with a brain system that hasn't fundamentally changed in thousands of years when the world is very small.
It's a funny concept in the world of social media.
Yeah, that's part of the problem, right?
Yeah.
One of the key things is we think automatically, we think in groups, we think in mental models of the world. Our brain evolved to be predictive. Why? Because we're more likely to survive if we can predict our social environment, even if we make big mistakes. But the thing about dehumanization, he said, is our brain's capacity to fully humanize people and to think what is our responsibility to them is limited because we literally would have to shut down all the other activities and thought processes to take that on. So think of walking by homeless people. When you really think about it, you say, do I carry money? Do I take them to a shelter? Do I go get them food? All of that literally requires energetic or cognitive bandwidth in the brain. But it's not an endless supply. And he says what we end up doing is stripping our responsibility to others. And that's a form of dehumanization.
You were talking about mental models, and I think they are very instrumental in terms of their impact on people's actions and behavior. But can you give us some examples?
Sure. It goes back just as a sort of framing. So we think automatically in milliseconds because we're all the descendants of people who didn't pause and ask, is there a good lion in that pride of lions?
Right.
We think in groups because we survive, with our parents and with the help of groups. And then third, we think in mental models of the world. And that's really important because that predictive brain that all humans, in fact, all species have, because the predictive brain predicts our physical and social environment in milliseconds. Because we're more likely to survive when we make the right choice that a pride of lions is likely a threat. And so our brain is constantly predicting those two environments, social and physical. And by the way, that's where misperceptions at a metascale come in. And it's also where context is important. Because if we haven't experienced something, either in our family or in our lived experience to that point, we need context to connect to a story or a narrative and experience we have to say, I get it. So mental models essentially are like the internal GPS system of the brain that bring this all together. And that comes on between 4 and 8 years of age. So, for example, we're doing a study, we're hopefully going to have a report coming out in the coming year, where we looked at how does racial preference or bias develop in young children. And we started looking at the ages between 4 and 8, because that's when the mental model comes on.
Right.
And where young children, in this case, see racial injustice or inequality either as an essentialist issue or a structural issue. Essentialist being, well, there's something innate about that community and there's nothing we can do about it. Think of how the Roma are treated in Europe or the untouchables in India or even homeless people. There's something innate about that community or those people once they get to that state. And essentialism is a very destructive mindset and lens. Or they can see it in structural terms. Wow, this racial inequality is not a result of this community or people. It's about the system. But that comes on in our research we find between 4 and 8. And the reason we looked at this is because several years ago, Emile Bruneau, who had been our lead scientist, who unfortunately passed away way too early, we were in LA at a conference. And a young woman had raised her hand and said, "Are children born racist?" And Emile's response was, "No, we have to teach them." Okay, what does it mean we have to teach them? How does that work in the human brain? And that's when he said, well, by 6 months, all children notice difference, but they don't make a preference based on that. So it's socially constructed. So I'll give you 2 examples, one current, one recent. Emile and I were talking about this before he passed away, and he said, so much effort is focused on convincing adults, obviously particularly white adults, of structural racism. And there's a lot of resistance to that. And he said, rather than seeing it just that they're racist, indifferent, stuck, whatever category we can put them in, part of it is their embedded mental model of the world was formed at a young age. So we know that children develop this mental model between 4 and 8. So that's the place to intervene to give them, a more honest understanding of the realities they see around them. Teenagers have what they call a window of malleability in the brain.
Especially in middle school. Where they're old enough to understand sophisticated concepts, but still young enough to have that kind of native idealism.
The brain is still developing, but it becomes much more difficult in adults. And yet look at most of the effort to deal with structural racism in the United States, whether it's anti-racist training, whether it's DEI work and so forth. We see the huge resistance. A lot of that is politically, culturally motivated.
Right.
But it's tapping into resistance because it's assuming that it will be possible, easy, or there's incentives for these adults to embrace and spend the time to unpack this. And what the researchers said, that's just very difficult, the way the brain works. And so we then came to the conclusion 6 years ago, before George Floyd's murder, if we're going to make a contribution, and we now have the tools of brain and behavioral science, let's see what happens in the development of these mental models. We have now 7 academic papers that our colleagues did at NYU, Princeton, and UPenn, and now we're translating that. Now, that's one example of how a mental model gets shaped. But also Rolf Meyer, who had been the key negotiator in the talks to end apartheid, he often talked about how he had a paradigm shift, that he came to realize that he not only grew up in, but benefited and defended a system of superiority versus inferiority. We did a conference several years ago, you may have been there, at MIT, called Building a More Inclusive City in 2016. So Rebecca and Emile gave sort of Brain 101 at the first panel, how we make these mental models of the world. The next panel was recognizing the need for change. And I had international leaders, and one of them was Rolf Meyer. And because he was an old friend and I asked him ahead of time, I introduced him to an audience of 300 people, half were of color. And I said, Rolf says that for the first 40 years of his life, and he was a member of parliament, he thought apartheid was not only good for whites, but also for people of color in South Africa. People were like, are you kidding me? And I said, you're having the same response that I had. But what did we just learn about mental models of the world? Rolf talks about how he had a paradigm shift, that he came to realize, wait a minute, how I see others, how I see myself is based in a paradigm that I slowly came to realize was corrupt and wrong, and how that shifted. Mm-hmm. And you could see people just sort of go, aha, in the audience by saying, here's how humans develop mental models of the world. Here's how they can sort of burden us, but here's how they can shift. And it was really a powerful moment. But think about, okay, if we can unpack this for young children, how do we understand the role mental models play in other conflict situations? And I was saying to a couple of colleagues, imagine if we had a new toolkit. So instead of saying, let's model people's interest, their needs, best alternative to negotiated, outcome. What if we model where people feel dehumanized, where others are dehumanizing, where sacred values are at play? How do you shift those mental models in a way that works?
And in a way that deals with the fact that they were embedded at
a
such
young
an
age,
early age.
and then reinforced by the system.
I mean, I'm very interested in the tools, and one interesting potential outcome from this research is that the way you spoke about it a minute ago, it was to better understand how dehumanization affects human behavior. And it's to it enables you to create new interventions and develop what your report calls practical tools to detect, disrupt, and reduce the impact of violent dehumanization. Tools like those sound very useful. Are they being developed? If yes, where are they being used?
What we found first was a lot of governments, a lot of organizations working either in human rights, mass atrocities, conflict, peace building, didn't really understand the research and science behind dehumanization.
Right.
So first was, how do we understand it? But since we're always interested in what do we do about it, when we went through this whole decoding dehumanization initiative, we then asked practitioners and leaders, what would you do with this research?
Right.
And what do we already know from the research that needs further analysis, but we feel comfortable can be applied right now? And one is improved early warning systems. So language can be a precursor to acts of gross violations of human rights. When you go back to the Rwandan genocide, there was one researcher who said that you could have gone 6, 8, 9, 10 months before the actual genocide started and see on the radio increasing language that was treating the other group in animalistic terms. So we know
cockroaches,
vermin, rats, and so forth. And you can go back to World War II. You can go back. I mean, even the United States used that against the Japanese and the Germans. People tend to do that, right? I mean, not people tend to do that, but governments, elites, and others can do it because they know it galvanizes people.
Exactly.
And what we thought was an early warning system would tell, let's say, a government or tell a human rights organization, that type of language, particularly in those frames, can begin to lead to people engaging in. Now, it has to be organized, but engaging in gross human rights violations, ethnic cleansing and genocide. And you can begin to see that happening months and months earlier. And that's when you intervene to stop it.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, we need ways of detecting it. But are there any violent conflicts where dehumanization does not play a role? In other words, or to put it another way, can you have a violent conflict without dehumanization?
Yes. You would think, a number of us thought, well, to kill another person, to see another as a threat means to some extent you're dehumanizing them, right? And there is an element of that. But we know that fear is a very different psychological process than dehumanization. We then, with additional funding, developed 2 interventions, one in Nigeria and one in the United States. And what we did in Nigeria, where there's significant communal violence, particularly between Christian and Muslim communities in certain states of Nigeria. The first thing we did was do a series of analysis by behavioral scientists working with local behavioral scientists and say, are we dealing with dehumanization between the 2 communities or fear? And what we found was more fear. Why? Because Christians and Muslims, when we did the blatant dehumanization index survey and others, which is a pretty blunt term, but it's blatant dehumanization, is a pretty horrible thing. It's the ascent of man scale from early primate to humans. Where would you place this group? Christians and Muslims didn't fundamentally dehumanize the other side. They saw them as equal humans, but they feared them. And psychologically, that's an important distinction, what the research has pointed out, because the interventions will then reflect, okay, how do we reduce fear rather than, you know, dehumanization if it's in a sort of blatant form or animalistic form. We find in dehumanization research that disgust is processed differently than fear. If you're on a plane and it's during COVID, let's say, or cold and flu season, and you're in an aisle seat and somebody walks by and sneezes on you, what is your automatic reaction? You pull back and you push away. Literally, you're trying to eradicate that threat. It is unseen. It is a pathogen threat. It is ancient. But what if you had bullies in high school? I had a few. And you see one coming on the plane. What do? Is you put your head down and hope this person doesn't see you. That's a fear response. Completely different psychological responses that can lead to different outcomes. And how you intervene is really important. We went into Nigeria thinking, oh, it must be dehumanization. And the research said, no, it's more fear. And so that then shaped the interventions we did in the media.
You know, that's very interesting. I mean, I've worked in Nigeria, and one of the tools that's unique that we had in Nigeria to work with were, you know, Nollywood is a huge producer of soap operas.
Right.
That is one way of getting these different ideas, these different approaches to conflict into the bloodstream of the, you know, the population. And we used some of those to reduce the perceptions of conflict there.
Well, you know, on Nigeria, which I'll just share with you quickly, you know, we tested with this research some radio interventions.
Mm-hmm.
Then we did some basic television. But then we were introduced to one of the largest soap opera producers in the country. And there's a soap opera that on average reaches 60 million household speakers in Nigeria. So we met with the showrunners and the producer. We said, what we'd like to do is have you introduce two characters, one Christian and Muslim. And we would work with you to shape those characters and their interactions. But we then want to test it. Now, this is doing a national, you know, established soap opera.
Right.
So it took months to get them comfortable with that. And then we did it. And we had this huge, you know, 60 million people at times watching the soap opera over weeks and months with these characters in it. And the results found, I'm just looking at this here, that it reported better interreligious attitudes, reduce feelings of dehumanization. It reduced a sense of competitive victimhood, willingness to participate in interreligious violence, and less willingness to participate in interreligious violence, and warmth to the other side.
I mean, that's the thing. They're modeling behavior.
Right.
And that's the power of that kind of media. You know, of course, it can be misused too. You know, it's similar in a sense. One of the things that we have with social media right now is it promotes divisiveness. And it is created to generate profits. But the same algorithms, the same tools could be used to promote social cohesion, you know, like in Nigeria. But it's going to take a Herculean effort to get the social media platforms to change that, to be able to use their algorithms in a different way.
You know, I think it's an existential problem we all face, and I'll tell you why. Scientists know where fear is processed in the brain and where memory is processed. Mm-hmm. Where do we process hope and aspiration?
Great question.
People often ask, why do people tune in more to negative news than positive news? Or I'll say to friends of mine and family, when you're in a restaurant, don't whisper. Because when you whisper, unconsciously, the brains or the ears next to you will increase their volume to hear what you're saying. Because we're deeply wired, this is thinking automatically. If they're whispering, and we may not even be consciously aware of it, this is something I need to know because it may be a threat or something negative about me. Mm-hmm. And so all these media systems, you know, when I say media, I mean social media, iPhones, television, and so forth.
Right.
What drives people in are negative stories, negative news. It's much easier to activate threat than it is to hope. And if you're not close to these people, if you're not in their group or they're not part of some affinity or identity you connect to, their success doesn't mean as much to you as a threat you feel. The fundamental problem is we're finding these powerful tools, insights, and research. The question is we're up against these platforms that really don't benefit from the good thing.
That are energized in the other direction. I mean, they're energized towards divisiveness because that's what produces the profits for the
Yeah.
platforms.
So we have this research. We've put it out in the world. It's gotten a lot of attention, not only by researchers, by governments. But here we are at this moment where we see increasing language of dehumanization. We see what's happening in the Middle East, Ukraine, and elsewhere.
Right.
And I said to my colleagues, we have this sort of vast literature and recommendations on dehumanization, but how do we get it out to the average person in a way they can access it? And so we came up with our new monthly newsletter. We didn't say what you need to know about dehumanization. I think the headline was, when somebody makes you feel less than human, you know how horrible that makes you feel. I'm paraphrasing. And then it leads people through. What is dehumanization? It's when you're treated less than human, when you're treated in a way that makes you feel shame, inadequate, threatened. I wanted to break through the binary, where we're all dehumanized and they're the dehumanizers, and to root it in context. Everybody, no matter where they live, can recognize when their family, their community may have been dehumanized in the past.
Right.
And how those narratives and stories still carry on and shape a part of one's identity.
It becomes, in a sense, inherited trauma.
It is. And even the narratives of it shape the way people think. By the way, one of the great insights from behavioral science is context, context, context. Our predictive brain needs context to understand and navigate a lived experience, other communities, other physical settings that you've never had exposure to. And then if you contextualize that in the brain, people can say, oh, I know when my Irish grandparents came here, there used to be a sign in the Boston Common, Irish keep off the grass. Or what happened to Native Americans or chattel slavery and its impact in this country.
To what extent do you think that political polarization in the U.S. is rooted in a fear of change?
In 2020, we did a report that's on our website called America's Divided Mind, Understanding the Psychology That Divides Us. And that looked at how is polarization being shaped in this country? We certainly know it's toxic, but what's happening in our psychology that is being impacted by increasing identity-based polarization? And then how in turn does our psychology then reinforce that? And, one of the key things that when polarization becomes identity-based, then a whole range of unconscious psychological processes come online to then weaponize that.
Right.
And then we looked at, okay, but are there any areas of real agreement in the United States? And looking at the misperceptions that Democrats and Republicans had on big issues, on feelings of like and dislike, and feeling dehumanized, we found that Democrats, Republicans in each of those categories overestimated the gap by 50%.
Now, that was very powerful in that video that you produced,
and it
which was great. And, and it's almost like the best kept secret is the fact that we do agree more than we disagree, but people don't realize it.
Well, here's the thing, Jamil, and this is what I struggle with. So there are a lot of good organizations out there doing dialogue work, bridge building work, and so forth. There are a lot of researchers doing work. I say to my researchers, either within Beyond Conflict and the partnerships we have, we need to align incentives so it's not just an academic publication that sits in the silo of the academy but gets translated into the world. And the second thing I said is, when people talk about we have more in common, that's true, but show them the evidence. And what we did is not only with that report, we then developed that video, which is on our website, and we said, okay, let's film people, Representative Trump and Biden supporters. This is in 2022.
Right.
What we found is when we asked the same questions, where are you as a Democrat or Republican on this issue or this feeling?
Right.
They made the same mistake. But then when he showed them the right answer, you can see their whole body change. It was like, you're kidding. Why don't I know that? And so that's the struggle is, how do we get this out? And one of the things we're looking at in terms of media interventions is to scale that. to get others trained in how you do these quick videos. And not just at a nationwide level, but regionally, because there'll be different issues on a regional basis.
Or even locally, yeah. Well, at Making Peace Visible, we are very heavily focused on the intersection between journalism and peace-building efforts, like the work that you've been doing all these years. What are the most important takeaways from the work that you've done, or the research you've done, that they can apply in their work describing conflicts and reporting on conflicts?
So about 6 years ago, you may know Charlie Sennett, used to be at the Boston Globe. So Charlie's an old friend, and he started Ground Truth and then Report for America. So we did some training for their new journalists and some of their editors 6 or 7 years ago. And we came in and said, here are the basics of brain science that are important to know as a journalist. You're all trained, as you know, in how to write narrative, how to contextualize a story. But there's another context that isn't taught in journalism school, in most places, which is how the human brain navigates the world through context. Even empathy is contingent on context. And I said, so the question you have to ask yourself is, in a hyperpolarized environment, if you're just framing he said, she said type stories, then it's not surprising why people are not reading your story, because they see the bias or they predict the bias up front.
Right.
So how do you, Amanda Ripley would say, how do you complicate the narrative?
Right.
But also, how do you, create an entry point where people see themselves in the story as they see themselves? Editors can do more damage by just putting a title.
Absolutely.
And what we found is we would say, okay, editors, that title may just shut anybody off from reading the story. And so we went through several trainings. And one of the key things that the journalists would say, particularly the younger generation, do you have any case studies on this? And what I said to Charlie and others, what we really need to do is start incorporating into journalism school some training.
Absolutely.
And ask, am I creating harm or am I advancing? In a world where facts are ignored, stories, narratives that connect to people can get them to listen to something where they think they see themselves in it, or where they may see themselves in it.
That is the powerful thing, I think. But yeah, there's some real good places, good ways for journalists to apply these lessons. And I just hope more of them can. Well, we're at the end now, and I really deeply appreciate your participating. Is there anything I didn't ask that you'd like to add to this?
Here's the key takeaway. I've been doing this work for 35 years. And as I mentioned, it was grounded in the power of the shared experience. But what the brain and behavioral science is showing is that we need to center, and a lot of people know this intuitively, and a lot of older ancient traditions get this. We need to focus on human cognition and emotion. And we now have evidence that it's not the stepchild to reason. In fact, our capacity to act with reason is dependent on our unconscious emotional brain. We need to frame our understanding of what shapes human behavior through the lens of human cognition and emotion. And we're having increasing scientific evidence. We're now seeing interventions that are working, and we're seeing people more looking to this because the world is increasingly irrational and we're finding more existential threats. And there needs to be a broader paradigm shift to recognize this reality. And the other is people like our president and many leaders around the world don't need to read a book or a briefing to manipulate.
Right.
Fear is a force multiplier. Understand that.
On the Beyond Conflict website, you can learn more about what Tim and his research teams have discovered looking at our brains when engaged in conflict, and especially their research on dehumanization. Just go to beyondconflictint.org. We have links to key takeaways from their research and the policy brief, Decoding Dehumanization, in the show notes. By the way, the retired neuroscientist who got Tim thinking about how conflict works in the brain, his name is Bob Deutsch. Tim also credits Donna Hicks for helping advance his understanding of human psychology and how it relates to conflict and reconciliation. Donna was our guest on an earlier episode of this podcast. That episode is called Dignity, a New Way to Look at Conflict, and you can also find a link to it in the show notes. Making Peace Visible is produced and edited by Andrea Maraskin with help from Faith McClure. I'm Jamil Simon. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.